Hey everybody, my name is Vitali and I am gonna make a video on the PREVOST suspension system. This particular diagram is, I believe, off of a 96, 97 XL coach, but this is going to be similar even for some earlier year XL2 coaches as well. But generally speaking, it's the older XL coaches that have the leans and have more air leak issues than the newer coaches. So something to understand here is that when we talk about the rear side of the coach, which is where most people have issues, there are essentially four components involved in terms of valves. So there's a 3-position valve for the left side, 3-position valve for the right side, and then there's a 2-position valve for the left side and a 2-position valve for the right side. Other than that, all these other valves are not anything to do with the leveling of the coach, and so they don't really matter when it comes to tracing down your leaks and figuring out how to keep the air in the airbags. So the first area to look at, by the way, these are found, these are about where they're pictured. So they're in front of the drive axle, and these are mounted on that wall there. If you crawl underneath the coach, you'll know what I'm talking about. But they're pretty easy to get to, especially if you get your coach up on little ramps like I did. And essentially what you want to do is you want to find if there are any leaks from this point and any of the bags, including this 2-position valve here as well. What this 2-position valve does is when you lift your tag, you're basically, you need to exhaust the air out of these bags so you can actually, so your tag axle can actually go up. And so when you flip your tag switch, what it's going to do is it's going to pressurize this line right here, and essentially it'll serve two purposes. One of them will go to this valve, which activates these brake chambers, which actually do the lifting, but simultaneously it's going to pressurize or engage these valves, which will basically open this rear bag to exhaust the air out of it so it can actually lift the tag. So again, the tag bag is the one that can actually exhaust air out while keeping the air locked into these two drive axle bags. So when you have the coach leveled off and you've parked it for the night, if everything works properly, if there are no leaks, then basically the air gets trapped in these lines that are going to the bags, through this valve, and to the tag axle bag. Now, most common leaks are going to be in your fittings, in your connections, and in your valves. So what I mean by that is it's usually not the actual airbag itself. The airbag has to get pretty darn old and start cracking and things like that in order for it to start leaking air out. So the first place I would check is in this 2-position valve. And these valves, if there's moisture that makes it into the lines and things like that, they'll corrode a little bit, and essentially they won't fully close on the exhaust port, and they can leak a little bit. So what you want to do is you want to spray soap solution on all the connections, especially these two, on this two-way valve, to essentially figure out if the air is leaking out through the valve. Because if it is, what it's going to do actually is it's going to potentially, depending on where the leak is, it's potentially going to deflate all three bags, or it'll deflate these two, and your tag will be still inflated, but it's not enough to hold the coach up. So you're going to spray basically the connection to the tag axle bag. You're going to spray this connection going into this two-way valve. You'll also spray this connection coming out of it. There will be a T connection there. So you essentially want to spray every single connection with this soapy water solution to see if there are any bubbles coming out. And so the last point you'll want to spray is this three-position valve, and make sure that it's not leaking. But you can still have leak issues if all of these connections are all sound and everything's really tight. But if your three-position valve internally is leaking, it'll also bleed these bags down. So it's one of those things where to really do a true test of no leak, you could disconnect disconnect all these lines, and when the tags or the bags are fully inflated, which is about 120 psi or so, you could check this valve to see if it's bypassing air out. Normally it shouldn't be, and if I was gonna fight my leaks, I would just replace these just to know that they're good, and I would also replace these two just to know that they're good as well. And so really, as you can see, it's a pretty simple system. It's not that many connections to check. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, essentially just 8 connections. And you'll be able to figure out where it's leaking along any of these. And what I did on my coach is I also sprayed down the bags as well, just to be sure. But again, it's highly unlikely that the bags will actually be leaking themselves. It's usually the interconnections. So that's essentially it. And you do the same thing for the other side. This leveling valve here has nothing to do with bleeding off pressure when you're in park mode, because there's a mechanism inside this valve that essentially blocks it off when you don't have the ignition on and you don't have the selector in the drive position. These leveling valves are basically non-functional. So again, you want to make sure that your valve is good, that it's not leaking. And the way to really check that is to disconnect, just disconnect these, it would be these 3 lines, and just spray soap solution on all the connections and make sure nothing's bubbling. That way it's holding. And then just go through and check all these other connections. And I'll make another little video to talk about how some of the older coaches out there have this tag lift mechanism that is reversed from how it's pictured here. And so that actually will give you issues. So I'll make another video and I'll explain that. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll do another video on the front side just to explain that a little bit more, but this video is focused on how to diagnose leaks in the rear 6 bags. All right.